Now, let's talk a little bit about manual controls on the camera. Anyone who wishes to improve the quality of the imagery they shoot through a DSLR needs to consider that they must operate the camera in a manual mode rather than an automatic mode. That is actually one of the most important aspects for a professional, the control that shooting in manual mode provides. If a camera were to not have these controls, it would be useless. Examples of essential controls which a camera needs to have includes focus, aperture, shutter speed, and white balance. First, exposure. When talking about digital cameras, the term exposure refers to the amount of light that is let onto the image sensor. If not enough light is let in, then the resultant captured image will be underexposed. If too much light is let in, then the image will be overexposed. Overexposure is a big problem because if you film with too much light, or if it is too bright out and you don't reduce the intensity with the aperture, then the image will clip. If you then try to later to fix the problem in post-production, you will find that you cannot bring out any information from clipped areas of the frame. Now, when it comes to underexposure, the situation is not ideal, but there are fixes that can be made after the fact. For example, if a scene is recorded too dark, there is still some detail in the recording that can be brought up with post-production tools. The only downside is that, as detail is brought up into view, there will also be visible grain that will show up. For these reasons, many filmmakers err on the side of caution when they film, preferring to underexpose an image rather than to overexpose it. Now, this is an image of the LCD display on my camera. I've turned on the zebra stripes, which highlight the areas of overexposure within the frame. In this image, almost the entire frame is overexposed. There are 3 essential exposure-related settings in your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These 3 settings are referred to as the exposure triangle. First, aperture. At the back of the lens, you will find the iris mechanism, which opens and closes to allow light into the camera. The iris can be opened up to allow light in or closed down to reduce the light that enters the camera. The opening is referred to as the aperture. There are 2 ways to control the aperture: manually or automatically. Now, it may be tempting to let the camera do the work and set your exposure for you, but automatic aperture will not give the best results. For example, imagine that the camera is set on automatic aperture and someone crosses in front of light as they run across the screen. The motion in the scene and the changing light will trigger the camera into changing the aperture. On the other hand, if you were to lock down an exposure level with a manual aperture control, the image would not get darker or brighter even if motion and light changes happen within the scene. The opening at the back of the lens, it has a variable size. If it is more open, then the iris does not stop a lot of light and the f-stop value is smaller. If it is more closed, then the iris stops more light and the f-stop value is larger. On the picture, we can see that the iris on the right is closed down more than the iris in the middle or on the left, so therefore it stops more light. Also, a lens can be fast or slow. If the minimum f-stop is low, then that lens is a fast lens and it will allow in more light. If the minimum f-stop is high, then that lens is a slow lens and it will let in less light. This picture shows the lens aperture ring on a Nikon prime lens. Okay, one thing we have to cover in more detail is f-stop. The following 3 images were shot with 3 different f-stop settings. The bottom right image is the darkest, as it was shot with f16. In the bottom right image, the plants or the darks are crushed. Now, the bottom left image is the correct exposure and it was shot with f7. At the correct exposure, we can see detail in the plants or the shadows, and also we see detail on the surface of the building or the highlights. Lastly, the top image is the brightest, and this was shot with f4. In this image, the highlights or the white areas of the building are overexposed. Now, this is a really interesting observation that I want to mention about aperture and sharpness. Lenses, they are not uniformly sharp across the entire aperture range. The general rule is, lenses are usually sharpest about 2 to 3 apertures smaller than the maximum aperture of the lens. However, stopping down the lens may mean that you have to increase the light level of the scene. If this is a possibility, do so, as it is worthwhile to shoot with a lens operating at its best aperture. To get an understanding of your lens, it is best to do a few tests with the lens and discover its performance qualities. Hopefully, you will find your lens's sweet spot. I also want to discuss a little bit about the shutter and the gain. I've shot short form and long form independent films, and most of the time, my photographer or I didn't find it necessary to alter the shutter speed or modify the gain. These settings, I think, are the last resort settings. You should be able to achieve proper exposure under most circumstances with a good set of lighting equipment and high performance, low light capable prime lenses. If you absolutely need to increase your gain, be aware that this will introduce some noise into the image. Some modern cameras are quite effective, and it will be possible to raise the gain a little bit without degrading the perceptible image quality. As for shutter speed, it's best to set it according to the frame rate. If you are shooting at 24 frames per second, and hopefully you are, then double the frame rate to 48 and set the shutter to about 1/48th of a second. In short, it is best to disable the gain, leave the shutter set to the predetermined value based on the frame rate, and simply adjust lighting and aperture to properly expose your scene.